Still, when every jeweler on the block had already turned him away, a billionaire stood on a cracked sidewalk, holding a broken watch that no longer meant just time to him. A repair shop owner had laughed politely and said the mechanism was beyond saving. A luxury boutique across the street had offered to sell him a replacement for $40,000 instead of even attempting a repair. And a 12-year-old girl sitting against the wall of a closed pharmacy, wrapped in a blanket that had more holes than fabric, looked up and said quietly, "I can fix that, if you let me." Her name was Nova. She was 12 years old, and she had been living on the streets of the city for a little over a year, ever since the apartment she shared with her grandmother had been condemned, and neither of them had been able to find anywhere else they could afford. Her grandmother, a woman named Odessa, had spent 40 years as a watch repair specialist at a small shop that had shut its doors when the owner retired, and nobody could afford to buy the lease. Nova had grown up sitting on a wooden stool behind the counter of that shop, close enough to watch her grandmother's hands work through gears smaller than grains of rice, close enough to learn, almost by accident, the same patient precision that had taken her grandmother decades to master. Before we continue, if you believe that skill has no address and that brilliance can live anywhere, even on a sidewalk, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that people are so often more than what they appear to be at first glance. Now back to the story. The billionaire's name was Julian Ashworth Cole. He was the founder of a technology investment firm that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the country by the time he turned 38, a man whose calendar was managed in 15-minute increments and whose mornings were measured not in hours but in meetings. The watch in his hand was not particularly valuable in the way most people would assume. It was not made of gold. It was not encrusted with anything. It was a plain, worn, mechanical watch that had belonged to his father, a man who had worked as a mechanic his entire life, and had given Julian the watch on the day Julian left for college. The same week, Julian's father had been diagnosed with the illness that would take his life 18 months later. Julian had worn that watch every single day for 19 years. He had worn it through the founding of his first company, through the collapse of his first marriage, through the birth of his daughter, through board meetings and funerals, and every ordinary Tuesday in between. That morning, reaching for his coat, he had knocked it off the dresser, and the crystal had cracked, and something inside the mechanism had gone quiet in a way that made his stomach drop the moment he picked it up and realized it had stopped ticking. He had gone to 4 different repair shops that day. 2 told him the movement was too old and too specific to source parts for. 1 told him it would take 8 weeks and could not guarantee success. The 4th, the luxury boutique, had barely looked at it before suggesting he simply purchase something new, something better, something that would not require the inconvenience of repair at all, as if the watch were nothing more than an accessory that had simply gone out of fashion, rather than the last physical thing that still smelled faintly, if he held it close enough, like his father's workshop. He was standing outside that 4th shop, turning the watch over in his hands, feeling something close to despair over an object most people would consider replaceable, when Nova spoke up from where she sat against the pharmacy wall. He almost walked past her. Most people did. But something about the specific way she had said it, not begging, not performing sympathy, just simply stating a fact, the way a person states something they know to be true, made him stop and actually look at her. "You're 12, he said, not unkindly, more confused than dismissive. "My grandmother taught me," Nova said. "She repaired watches for 40 years. I used to help her when I was little. I still remember most of it." Julian looked at the girl, at her chapped hands, at the blanket around her shoulders, and felt the particular internal conflict of a man who had spent his entire career trusting data and instinct in equal measure, uncertain which instinct to trust in this moment. He had every reason to walk away. He had none of the tools she would need, no workbench, no proper lighting, nothing but a park bench and a girl who claimed to remember something she had learned as a young child. But something about the stillness in her hands when she held them out, waiting, made him sit down on the curb beside her instead of walking away. "Show me," he said. Nova asked him for a few things, most of which he did not have on him, but 2 blocks away there was a hardware store, and within 20 minutes Julian Cole, a man who managed a portfolio worth billions of dollars, was standing at a hardware store counter buying a tiny precision screwdriver set and a magnifying loupe for a homeless 12-year-old girl he had met 10 minutes earlier, because some quiet part of him had decided he needed to see this through. What happened over the next 40 minutes, sitting together on a curb outside a pharmacy as the evening traffic moved past them, was something Julian would later describe as the most honest conversation with a stranger he had had in over a decade. Nova worked with a focus that reminded him, painfully and beautifully, of his father bent over an engine in their garage on Saturday mornings. The same total absorption, the same complete disappearance into the task at hand. She talked while she worked, not nervously, but naturally, the way a person talks when they are comfortable in what their hands are doing. She told him about her grandmother, about the shop, about the 40 years of customers who used to bring in watches that meant more to them than their monetary value ever could. Anniversary gifts, inherited pieces, watches worn on wedding days. She told him that her grandmother used to say that a watch repair specialist's real job was never fixing metal. It was helping people hold on to time they were afraid of losing. Julian, listening, found himself gripping the curb edge harder than he meant to, because that sentence had landed somewhere in him that his therapist had spent 2 years trying to reach. She told him, without any self-pity in her voice, about the year since the apartment closure, about how her grandmother's health had declined without proper care, about how Nova had been staying near the pharmacy, because the owner, a woman named Priscilla, let her sit under the awning at night, and sometimes brought out leftover sandwiches, without ever making a show of it. She told him she still practiced on broken watches she found in donation bins and dumpsters, because her grandmother, even now weak and often confused, still lit up with recognition whenever Nova brought a repaired piece to show her, still remembered, in the moments that mattered, that she had taught her granddaughter something real. And then, 40 minutes in, with a precision that made Julian's breath catch, Nova set the tiny gear back into place, closed the case, and the watch began to tick again. She handed it back to him and said the words that would end up staying with Julian Cole for the rest of his life. The words that, when he later told this story to his board of directors during an unusually personal opening to an otherwise ordinary quarterly meeting, made even the most hardened executives in the room go quiet. "It's not really the watch you were trying to save," she said. "It's the part of him that's still inside it. I think that's why it mattered so much to me, too. My grandmother is still here, but some days it feels like she's already gone somewhere I can't follow her to. Fixing things like this is the only way I know how to hold on to her." Julian Cole, a man who had negotiated $100 million acquisitions without his pulse changing, sat on a curb outside a pharmacy and found himself unable to speak for a long moment, because a 12-year-old girl with chapped hands and a blanket full of holes had just said, more precisely than any grief counselor ever had, the exact thing he had spent 19 years wearing a watch, instead of saying out loud. Before we go any further, we want to pause here, because what Nova did on that curb is only the visible part of this story. The rest belongs to the people who made her capable of it. Odessa, her grandmother, who had spent 40 years teaching not just mechanics, but patience, precision, and the belief that fixing something broken was always worth the careful effort it required. Priscilla, the pharmacy owner, who let a homeless child sleep under her awning and never once made her feel like a burden for needing somewhere safe to be. A librarian named Corinne, 2 blocks from the pharmacy, who let Nova come in every afternoon to look up watch mechanism diagrams on the public computers, never asking why a child without a fixed address needed to know so much about gear ratios. None of them were on that curb that evening. All of them were. That night, Julian did not simply thank Nova and walk away with his repaired watch. He asked her where her grandmother was. Nova explained that Odessa was currently in a shared room at an underfunded care facility on the edge of the city, one of the only places that had accepted her without a deposit Nova could not afford. Julian asked if he could meet her. Nova, cautious in the way children who have learned caution the hard way often are, asked him why. He told her the truth, the same truth he would tell his board months later. He said that in 19 years of wearing his father's watch, he had never once let himself fully feel what it represented until a stranger's granddaughter had said it out loud to him on a curb, and that he did not know exactly what he wanted to do with that feeling yet, except that he knew he did not want to simply say, "Thank you," and drive away. What followed was not, Julian insisted from the very beginning, charity, and Nova would not have accepted it if it had been. It began with him visiting Odessa the following week, sitting with her for over an hour, listening to her talk about 4 decades of repaired watches, with the same clarity she had on good days and the same gentle confusion she had on harder ones. He arranged, quietly and without fanfare, for Odessa to be moved to a proper memory care facility with actual specialized staff, the kind of place Nova had never been able to afford even to consider. He arranged for Nova to have stable housing nearby, with a foster family connected through a program his foundation had quietly supported for years, so that she could visit her grandmother every single day after school, a school she was now, for the first time in over a year, actually able to attend. He did something else too, something that took him longer to work up the courage to offer, because it required him to admit out loud what he wanted for himself as much as for her. He asked Nova if she would want to apprentice, formally, with a master watchmaker he knew, an old friend of his father's who had trained under some of the finest horologists in Switzerland before retiring to a small workshop 2 hours outside the city. Nova, who had spent a year believing that the only inheritance her grandmother could leave her was a skill nobody around her seemed to value, cried for the first time in front of Julian when she said yes. 3 years passed. Nova, now 15, spent her weekends at the workshop, her hands growing steadier and more confident with every passing month, working now not on scavenged watches from donation bins, but on genuine antique pieces that collectors trusted to her care. A trust she had earned through the same quiet precision that had first caught Julian's attention on that sidewalk. Odessa's decline continued, gently, the way these things do, but on her good days, Nova would bring a repaired watch to show her, and something in her grandmother's eyes would still light up in recognition, still remember, even amid everything else being lost, that she had once taught her granddaughter something that mattered. Julian visited the workshop often, no longer as a stranger who owed a debt, but as something closer to family, a presence Nova had come to trust the way she once trusted only her grandmother. His own relationship with his father's memory had shifted in ways he had not expected. He wore the watch still, every day, but it no longer felt like the last surviving piece of a man he had lost. It felt instead like proof that the things we love do not have to stay broken simply because they have been damaged, that repair, real repair, patient and careful and unhurried, is always still possible if someone is willing to sit down and try. The night before Nova's first solo commission, a genuine 1950s pocket watch belonging to a retired judge who had heard about her through Julian's recommendation, she sat with her grandmother at the care facility and told her everything: the workshop, the training, Julian, the judge's commission, all of it. Odessa, on a clearer day than most that month, took Nova's hand in both of hers and told her that she had always known, from the very first time she watched a 6-year-old Nova hold a tiny screwdriver with more patience than most adults could manage, that her hands were meant for exactly this kind of work. Nova wrote a letter that same week, not to Julian, who by then she saw regularly enough that letters felt unnecessary, but to Priscilla, the pharmacy owner who had let her sleep under an awning without ever making her feel small for needing to. She told her everything that had happened since, the workshop, her grandmother's care, the life she had slowly been allowed to rebuild. Priscilla wrote back within the week, saying she still kept the awning light on a little longer at night out of habit, just in case another child needed somewhere safe to sit for a while, and that Nova's letter had reminded her exactly why that habit still mattered. In the weeks after that first meeting with Odessa, Julian found himself doing something he had not done in years, something small that his executive assistant, a man named Desmond who had worked for him for over a decade, noticed almost immediately. Julian started leaving the office at a reasonable hour again. He started reading before bed instead of scrolling through market reports. He started, for the first time since his father's death, wearing his watch not as a habit he had stopped noticing, but as something he actively looked down at throughout the day, aware of it, grateful for it, the way you become newly grateful for something you almost lost. He did not make a public spectacle of what he was doing for Nova and Odessa. He believed, the way Nova's grandmother had once believed about repair work itself, that the value of the effort was in the doing, not in being seen doing it. But those closest to him noticed the shift. He laughed more easily in meetings. He stopped working weekends the way he once had. His ex-wife, with whom his relationship had grown distant and businesslike over the years, mentioned to a mutual friend that their daughter had recently described her father as, for the first time she could remember, actually present during their visits. Nova's adjustment to her new life did not happen without difficulty, the way it rarely does for anyone who has spent a year learning to survive rather than simply live. In her first months at her new school, she struggled to relate to classmates who had never once had to worry about where they would sleep, who complained about homework loads with an ease that felt almost foreign to a girl who had spent the previous year worrying about far larger things. A teacher named Ms. Alvarez noticed her sitting alone during a free period, sketching gear mechanisms in the margin of her notebook instead of doing the assigned reading, and instead of scolding her, sat down beside her and asked what she was drawing. When Nova explained, Hesitant at first, unsure whether an adult would find it strange, Ms. Alvarez asked question after question, genuinely curious, and eventually connected her with an after-school engineering club that met twice a week. It was not watch repair exactly, but it was close enough in spirit, gears, and mechanisms, and the satisfaction of understanding how small parts work together to create something functional. And Nova found, for the first time since arriving at the new school, a group of peers who thought her strange fascination with tiny machinery was not strange at all, but genuinely impressive. Odessa's care facility, the one Julian had arranged, became a place Nova visited every single day after school without fail, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours, depending on how her grandmother was feeling. The staff there, unlike the underfunded facility Odessa had been in before, understood memory care in a way that made even the hardest days gentler. A nurse named Inez, who worked the afternoon shift, made a habit of setting aside a comfortable chair by the window for Nova, understanding without being told that some evenings, Nova needed simply to sit beside her grandmother in silence more than she needed to talk. The apprenticeship with Julian's old family friend, a watchmaker named Anton Reyes, who had trained for a decade in Switzerland before returning home to open a small workshop, began cautiously. Anton was a meticulous man, unaccustomed to teaching, and for the first several weeks he mostly observed Nova in silence, testing her patience, testing her hands, giving her nothing but the simplest cleaning tasks while he watched to see whether her enthusiasm would fade under the tedium real training required. It did not fade. If anything, Nova approached even the most mundane polishing tasks with the same total absorption Julian had first noticed on the curb outside the pharmacy, and by the end of the second month, Anton had begun handing her genuine repair work, starting small, an old alarm clock, a broken pocket watch clasp, gradually working up to more delicate and valuable pieces as her confidence grew. By her 14th birthday, Nova had repaired 11 customer pieces under Anton's supervision, each one signed off in a small logbook he kept. A record, he told her, with uncharacteristic warmth for a man who rarely showed much emotion, that he intended to keep for the rest of his career, because he wanted proof in writing of exactly when he first knew she would surpass him. The family that gathered for her birthday that year looked nothing like anything Nova could have imagined a year earlier, sitting against a pharmacy wall with nothing but a blanket and her grandmother's remembered lessons. Priscilla came, bringing a cake she had baked herself, still keeping the pharmacy awning light on a little longer some nights out of habit. Ms. Alvarez came, bringing a small, gear-shaped pendant she had found at a flea market because she remembered Nova once mentioning she liked the way gears looked. All interlocking purpose, nothing wasted. Anton came, gruff as always, but he brought with him the pocket watch that had been Nova's first solo commission, the retired judge's watch, now fully restored, having arranged quietly with the judge to buy it back so that Nova could keep a piece of her own earliest independent work. And Julian came, carrying a small box that, when Nova opened it, turned out to contain a set of precision tools, far finer than anything she had used before. Tools that had belonged, he explained, to his father. Tools his father had used not for watches but for engines. Kept all these years in a drawer Julian had never been able to bring himself to empty until now. He told her that his father had always believed that fixing things, real things, careful things, was one of the most honest forms of love a person could offer, and that he could think of nobody better to carry that belief forward than her. That evening, after the guests had left, Nova sat with Julian on the back steps of the foster home that had become, gradually, and without either of them quite noticing when it happened, something that felt like a real home. Julian asked her, the way he sometimes did now, what she pictured for herself years from now, once her apprenticeship was complete. Nova thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said she wanted to open her own shop someday, not a large one, not a fashionable one, just a small workshop like the one her grandmother used to run, somewhere people could bring the things that mattered to them, not because they were valuable in dollars, but because they carried someone inside them worth holding on to. She wanted to teach the way her grandmother had taught her, the way Anton was now teaching her, patiently, without ever making someone feel foolish for needing to learn slowly. She said she wanted every child who ever sat outside a pharmacy wrapped in a blanket to know that the things they already carry inside them, whatever they happen to be, are worth someone stopping to notice. Julian did not say much in response. He did not need to. He simply looked out at the yard for a while, feeling the familiar, steady weight of his father's watch against his wrist, and understood, without needing to say it out loud, that some repairs take much longer than 40 minutes on a curb, and that some of them are never really finished, only continued, one careful, patient day at a time. There was one more part of the story that Nova rarely told anyone outside her closest circle, though it was, in many ways, the part that mattered most to her. 6 months into her apprenticeship, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a woman had walked into Anton's workshop carrying a battered gold locket watch, the kind worn on a chain rather than a wrist, asking whether anyone there could possibly repair something that 3 separate jewelers had already told her was beyond saving. Anton had been out that day, and Nova, still technically an apprentice, had been the only one in the shop. The woman, whose name was Beatrice, explained through tears that the watch had belonged to her late husband, that the mechanism had seized entirely, and that she had been told the parts required no longer existed anywhere in the country. Nova recognized the make immediately, an older European movement her grandmother had once shown her photographs of in a catalog. Rare, but not, Nova believed, impossible. She spent the next 4 days researching, sourcing a replacement part from a supplier in another state that Anton himself had never worked with, teaching herself, through trial and painstaking error, the specific quirks of a mechanism she had never actually held in her hands before that week. When she finally returned the watch to Beatrice, ticking steadily for the first time in over a year, Beatrice had cried so hard she could not speak for several minutes, and when she finally could, she told Nova that she had begun to believe she would never hear that particular ticking sound again, the sound that used to fill her kitchen every morning while her husband made coffee, and that having it back felt like getting a small, impossible piece of him returned to her. Anton, when he heard about it, did not scold Nova for taking on a repair beyond her official experience level. He simply added a new page to his logbook and wrote, in his careful handwriting, that this was the day he stopped thinking of her as his apprentice and started thinking of her as his equal in training only, not in talent. Nova kept a photograph of Beatrice's locket watch tucked inside her own toolkit from that day forward, a reminder, she said, of exactly why the work mattered beyond the mechanics of it. Julian heard the story secondhand from Anton during one of his regular visits to the workshop and found himself thinking about it for days afterward, turning it over the way he might turn over a difficult business decision, except this one required no decision at all, only recognition. He understood, more clearly than he ever had before, that what Nova had given him on that curb outside the pharmacy was not a fluke, not a single moment of unusual talent meeting unusual circumstance, but a genuine, repeatable gift, one she had already begun sharing with strangers who needed exactly what she had once needed herself, someone willing to sit down, look closely, and refuse to give up on something everyone else had already called unfixable. It was around this time that Julian made a decision he had been quietly considering for months. He approached Nova, now 14 and a half, with a proposal that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the thing she had told him she wanted for her future. He offered to help her set up, once she turned 18, and completed her formal training under Anton, a small nonprofit workshop of her own, one that would take on repair apprentices specifically from group homes, shelters, and foster placements, young people who, like her, might have hidden and extraordinary skills nobody had yet noticed because nobody had yet thought to look. Nova cried again when he told her, the second time he had seen her cry in the 2 years he had known her, and both times, he realized, had been tears of a very particular kind, not sadness, but the specific overwhelming relief of being truly seen and believed in by someone with the power to make that belief mean something lasting. Never assume that expertise requires a certain address to develop. Never mistake a blanket full of holes for a mind or a set of hands, without extraordinary skill inside it. Never underestimate what a child can build out of watching someone they love do careful, patient work, even in the hardest circumstances. And never forget that sometimes the things we think we are trying to fix are never really about the object in our hands at all, but about the people, present or lost, who are still living somewhere inside them. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about what part of Nova's story stayed with you, and share it with someone who needs to believe that broken things and broken people are so often more repairable than we assume. Subscribe for more stories about resilience, quiet brilliance, and the unexpected people who end up teaching us the most important lessons of our lives. Because sometimes the most valuable thing in the room is not the watch on someone's wrist, but the person sitting quietly beside them who understands exactly what it means to hold on to time.